Pat Coogan to Indiana, a huge piece for this Indiana offensive line. I mentioned him in my very first video when I talked about this stuff. I said there wasn't any smoke, but it seems like a big, a genuine fit. It seems like something that where Pat Coogan could go to Indiana, get playing time right away. He would be a great piece for him. Not only is he, did he have a good season playing this year, but he's also a very energetic player. He's a leader. He's somebody that, brings a lot of experience to this Indiana offensive line. Zach, when you and I talked about the offensive line in the transfer portal, we said like you need to go out and at least get guys who are backups on Power Five teams. Well, Indiana went out and they got a guy who was a starter on the national runner-up this year. Now you talk to a Notre Dame fan and they say he's not going to be a starter next year. Whatever, if and buts, whatever. But at the fact is, he started for this team last year when they made it to the national championship game. So for me, that's a huge get for Kirk Signetti. Their offensive line is in much better shape this year than it was last year, and they played well last year for a good amount of the year. It was really at the end of the year when things started to get more dicey. But you got Carter Smith coming back. You've got Pat Coogan, Zen Mikulski, who he got hurt last year for playing for Ohio State, but he's still an Ohio State caliber offensive lineman. We'll see if Kirk Cinetti, maybe him getting full-time reps in the offseason will help him be, a little bit more developed and ready for that. We'll see, but I really like what Indiana did by getting Pat Coogan here, and I think it was a really nice ad. What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at Indiana's transfer class and they're recruiting in the transfer portal like you would expect a mid to top tier team would, which is they're not settling, they are getting legit prospects like a Mendoza at quarterback, like Pat Coogan. And listen, I don't care what Notre Dame fans say. He maybe he is the seventh or eighth lineman, right? I don't care because he played well for a team that bulldozed guys in the playoff. Like you're talking about guys that were beat up by this Notre Dame offensive line, Georgia, and by the way, the Indiana Hoosiers and Penn State, and even at I for especially for the quarterback run, they had some nice plays against Ohio State. So I get that Notre Dame is saying like, "Hey, we have a lot more depth," and they do, and I think that's a trademark of Marcus Freeman's program. Good for them. This is a big thing. This is a big deal for Indiana, especially beating out other teams that were slated. I think it was Michigan who was in on both Coogan and Spindler, and for Indiana to go out beat other Big Ten programs for Pat Coogan. Again, we keep saying it, but the star power, I think, matters just as much as the talent. Like name recognition is going to do wonders for Indiana and for Kurt Signetti. Probably the biggest thing is can they temper expectations so that they don't overpromise and underdeliver? Because right now, I think what they're bringing in, it could overpromise something that could then be disappointing. But right now, I think what you're seeing is Indiana star continues to rise.
They do. They do. Uh, Thank you, John, for looking up those stats. Appreciate it. I do remember looking those up as well. I did not mention them, but one sack, two QB hits allowed in 438 blocking snaps. That is impressive. Terry is saying you underestimated us, JR. We had you had us third in both of them. I'll be honest. I don't know if I ever said third for Pat Coogan. If I did, I don't remember saying that, so I apologize. But I do remember saying Rocco Spindler they were most likely not going to get because I felt like they needed more of a center, and I felt like, or I heard that not Pat, Rocco Spindler was looking at being either a guard or a tackle, that he wasn't so much interested in center. But I do remember saying like if Pat Coogan is interested, you need to go after him because you need to get him. But as far as I'm concerned, like this is a huge ad, not just for the blocking and the ability and everything like that, but a leader, somebody who's going to be able to communicate better with the fellow players on his offensive line. Like we saw what happened last year, and I'm going to use him as an example because I know there's a lot of Ohio State fans in the chat, but with Ohio State last year, you had a guy who was super inexperienced at center, 2 years ago, and he he did not know how to lead that offensive line nearly as well. You bring in Seth McLaughlin, who was the Remington Award winner. That offensive line looked 10 times better, not because Seth McLaughlin was, 10 times the better blocker than Carson Hinsman was. I mean, he was a better blocker. I'm not, saying he wasn't good or anything like that. But he also ran checks at the offensive line. He also was a leader. He was also working with those guys in practice every single day. Like, that kind of stuff is the stuff we don't see. And I think that is the kind of stuff, not just the blocking and the ability from Pat Coogan, but it's that kind of stuff to me that is going to be so valuable to this Indiana team because they already have a good offensive line coach. What's his name from Wisconsin?
Oh
He came over to
gosh,
Indiana. I apologize, can't remember his name. Somebody put it in the chat. I know there's an IU fan that knows his name, but he was at Wisconsin for
Bob Bostad.
Bob Bostad. Okay, that's right. Bob Bostad. Yeah, John Jacobs right there. Thank you. He was at Wisconsin for a while, and then he went back to Wisconsin for a year. Then he went back to Indiana. Like he's going to be able to coach Pat Coogan up, and this is going to be a good offensive line next year. It's not a question of will they be a good offensive line against every team. They're going to be a very good offensive line against every team. It's going to be are they going to be able to hold up and withstand against the best defensive lines that they see, right? Are they going to be able to hold up and withstand against Illinois? Are they going to be able to hold up and withstand against Oregon? Do they play Oregon this year? I believe they do.
Yep.
Oregon. Are they going to be able to hold up and withstand against the other like top tier teams in the Big Ten that they play? Because if we're all being honest, like that was one of the biggest issues against Ohio State. Now, playing at Ohio State and the noise and everything like that is obviously a factor, but you get what I'm saying. This was the missing piece for a lot of their issues last year in their bigger games, and Kirk Cinetti has gone out and he's done his best to rectify it and make it better, and I applaud Kirk Cinetti for that.
Yep. I think one thing I'll mention, I think Indiana will be a better team next year, but I think their record's going to not be as good. And the reason people are putting in the chat, they're at Iowa, they're at Oregon, they're at Penn State, they're at Wisconsin. Or no, they're not at Wisconsin. They host Wisconsin.
And say they're home against Wisconsin.
Yeah, sorry, I misread the schedule. But they get Illinois at home. Like it's a tougher schedule than a year ago. And as we want to be fair here, like Indiana deserved to be in the playoff, but like the strength of schedule criticism was valid as well. And the Big Ten scheduling this year is a lot tougher. And that doesn't mean that Indiana can't do well, but I think the reality, the degree of difficulty is definitely higher. And so if Indiana, say, is 9-3, I don't think that means that they took a step back. I think it could mean that they're actually a much better team. They're just now taking a step up in competition. If they go 9-3 and get a big win on the road, that actually might be more impressive than what they've done this past year.
Yeah, no, I agree. Billy Tuesday is absolutely right. Illinois, Indiana is going to be must watch, must
Banger.
see TV.
Banger.
And John, thank you. Yes, love the cup. You too can buy your own the Big Ten Huddle cup in the merchandise shop store and everything like that. So go check it out. Other T-shirts there as well. No, but I totally agree with you, Zach. I think Indiana is going to be a better team next year than what they were. I'm not as sure the defense will be as good next year just because they do lose some key interior players on the defensive line, CJ West, guys like that. So I do think they lose some there. Mikel Kamara is coming back, so that's huge. But we'll see if the defense can still play up to that same level because you still got D'Angelo Pons back, and you brought in a good number of defensive backs. I think Johnson, he left because you brought in other, quite frankly, better defensive backs who were going to play over him. It stinks. You don't want to see a guy leave, but that's the reality of college football, which is if you can find guys better than what you have, you bring them in. And that's the other demeanor that I love about Kirk Cinetti is that he's not afraid to do that. He's going to make this team as best he possibly can. And so if that means looking at a guy on, that is a pretty good corner, but bringing in a better corner, that's what he's going to do because he wants to win.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's see if there's any more thoughts in the chat or anything. Um, no, nothing much else. Just a lot of talk about the schedule. And I think some people take. I never meant it this way, and I think you're the same way, Zach. Some people take like the easy schedule for Indiana as like an insult on Indiana. I never meant it that way. I just was acknowledging that there are not as many good teams on Indiana's schedule as there are for other teams. I mean, you and I
Mhm.
still advocated all season long. Like, even though they don't have as hard of a schedule as some other teams, like, they are still looking impressive in these games. They are still doing a good job of taking down opponents. Like, this is
Yeah.
still a very good team. You can see how well coached they are. You can see how well they work together. The Michigan game was a little concerning for some. There were obviously some concerns in it, but I also like the fight they had in that one.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anything else on
I
that before we move on?
I think sometimes I I think sometimes we start to, how do I put this? So like I understand why people see it as an insult because it almost starts to devalue what you accomplish. And that's not what we're doing. I think some people use it that way. But I'll take the Nebraska win, for example. I mean, they crushed them 56-7. And that became less about Indiana's dominance and more about, well, Nebraska sucks, which they didn't suck. Like, they were a decent team. Like, if you looked at all the metrics, you looked at all the, the ratings, they were a middle of the road team and they stomped them. They smoked them, but they got no credit for it. Um, I shouldn't say they got no credit for it, but I think people started to look at Nebraska and Washington and teams that were bowl teams and basically like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that you smoked them because they suck. And it's like, no, like, I don't think that's what I think there's a difference between talking objectively about a strength of schedule versus devaluing your opponent so much that you're denigrating anything you accomplished. And we're not, I think we want to fight against the latter while also acknowledging the former. Like, Indiana's schedule was not great last year, but also like they beat a bunch of teams that were, in past years they would get smoked by. So like I think we have to acknowledge, yes, the degree of difficulty was not what most other teams had. And also Indiana in previous seasons would have gotten smoked by a lot of those teams. And instead they smoked them.
Yeah, and that's really what we were saying from the beginning is we were like, guys, you might say like, oh, these teams stink, but these are still teams that would have smoked Indiana last year or 2 years ago. Like, so we can say, the schedule isn't as good, but this is also, I mean, this is also a Big Ten issue. This is the last thing I'll say on this, and then we'll move on. This is also just a Big Ten issue, though, right? Like the SEC, if South Carolina goes and blows out Missouri, nobody says like, oh, Missouri must be terrible, you know? Like everybody looks and says, "Wow, South Carolina is this great team. Look at how amazing they are. They're fantastic. Look at how well they played." But in the Big Ten, if Indiana beats Nebraska, it's like, "Well, Nebraska's terrible." It's like, no, they're not terrible. They destroyed Colorado. They played a tight game
Yeah.
against Illinois. They had opportunities to win that game. Now, yes, they squandered them, but still, like that was a very good game between those two teams. Like Nebraska's not a bad team, and they weren't a bad team last year. But because Indiana beats them so good, people look at that and they're like, "Oh, well, Nebraska stinks." No, they're not. They don't stink. If you watch that game, Matt Rule never relented, and he tried to win the game the entire time. Maybe that was a little foolish by Matt Rule, but at the end of the day, like this wasn't a game where they just got spanked the entire time. This is a game where Nebraska remained aggressive and Indiana remained aggressive too.
Yeah.
So
And it
yeah.
was, I'm getting uh poked by the chat. They did it with a quarterback with a torn ACL, right? Like,
Yeah.
so that matters. Matters.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Terry.